All right, hello. I am Sarah Larman, and this is my second cognitive science teachback on Senghis, Kita, and Ozerek's essay, Children Creating Core Properties of Language, Evidence from an Emerging Sign Language in Nicaragua. To begin, this essay is aiming to identify core language learning processes between the older and younger generations of sign language users in Nicaragua. They delve into the foundation elements, as well as the hierarchical structures found in the emerging NSL, Nicaraguan Sign Language, and they propose segmentation and recombination that they believe reflect the mechanisms of language learning. First, the essay looks to define design features. Design features are the specific properties of language that are central to how language operates. The study of the essay questions whether or not properties of language are innate through language learning mechanisms by looking at the discreteness and combinatorial patterning of language learning. Language is a hierarchical system of categorical, recombinable parts. The essay states that, quote, we have discrete sounds that are combined to form words, that are combined to form phrases, and then sentences, and so on, end quote. Experiences that are continuous and holistic are formulated in a discrete and combinatorial fashion. These account for the infinite patterns and expressions that language can express. These characteristics are important for communication and can still be used without the latter components. Communication has the capability to use other mediums for language, such as using maps or paintings. These use an iconic structure that corresponds with physical things in the world. These analog and holistic representations can describe just as much as a spoken language, if not more. Maps and paintings can represent an entire situation with multiple elements defining one big picture with included meanings of each component. The study of this paper focuses on the creation of a language that uses discreteness and combinatorial patterning. A type of language has become relevant in the deaf Nicaraguan community within the past 2 decades. Without a developmental type of language, we can find the fundamental properties of where non-linguistics become linguistics. Within this community, the development of sign language was not recognized until the 1970s. Before then, sign language would be used primarily at home and at a few schools and clinics due to societal attitudes. Sign language was not widely seen in social contexts outside of use between family and home settings. This led to the creation of home signs. Home signs are the signs or gestures of communication system that each family has within their familial community. Home signs stem from communication within a household where common gestures dominate and turn into familiar home signs. Given these signs are ones common to one household, they vary from one deaf person to the next in both form and complexity. When more schools opened for special education in 1977, followed by vocational schools in 1981, the increase of deaf students in the program increased from 50 students to about 200 students through the 1980s. Through more prominent and timely readings, these children were able to develop a new gestural system of communicating with each other. These gestures soon became the new sign language used socially and individually. This sign language has moved through generations, leaving it to be improved by each new generation. Today, there are about 800 new deaf signers of Nicaraguan Sign Language, ranging from 4 to 45 years of age. With the age group being generally younger, it has been found that grammar changes to the language are leading in pre-adolescence rather than children or adults. This event has led to the study of the paper in which we look at different cohorts of NSL users. We are looking at different ages due to the finding that the younger signers are more fluent and experienced in the newer, expanded, and developed form of NSL. For the present study, we look at 30 signers that have a relational age to the time they were first exposed to NSL. The first cohort consisted of 10 participants exposed to NSL before 1984. The next 10 were exposed from 1984 to 1993, and the third exposed after 1993. All 30 deaf participants have been signing since they were 6 years of age or younger. The study then compared their sign gestures to gestures of 10 hearing Nicaraguan Spanish speakers while speaking Spanish. These gestures were ones describing examples of complex motion events. Motion expressions were used for two reasons. First, previous research has found that when speakers describe motion, they produce co-speech gestures that iconically represent the movements. Secondly, motion expressions offer a domain for detecting segmented, linear, and hierarchical organization of the communication system. This is important in identifying the manner and path idea of communication. Each event has a manner and path aspect which are iconically represented simultaneously, whereas language is segmented and combined syntactically. Manner and path by themselves are separate categories that combine to make sentences and communication. Manner is the way in which something happened. The manner is a movement or action of running or scooting. Path is the directional aspect of the pattern. This is up, left, right, down, etc. Signing used manner and path, but not simultaneously as one figure, but rather sequentially in manner and path elements. This shows segmentation and linearization typical of developed language, unlike motion itself. The study of this essay takes the participants and has them watch a cartoon when they have to describe and tell another person the story of what they just watched. The deaf participants signed the story while the hearing participants spoke Spanish. Gestures made from all groups were analyzed for manner and path information in respect to how it was integrated. This integration was shown simultaneously as a single hand movement and/or as a sequential string of simple manner-only or path-only elements. The simultaneous gesturing was mainly done by the first cohort of the older generation, whereas the sequential signing was done by the second and third cohorts, which are the two younger cohorts. One analysis of the gestures showed the simultaneous manner path gesturing of expressions. All the Spanish speakers at a proportion of 1.0, and most of the first cohort at a proportion of 0.73 used simultaneous gesturing. The second and third cohorts used fewer simultaneous gestures at 0.3 and 0.8 respective proportions. In a second analysis, we look at expressions that use manner and path sequentially. Spanish speakers are never observed using gestures sequentially at a proportion of 0. The first cohort mildly uses them at a proportion of 0.27, whereas the third and second cohorts include sequences for their sentences at 0.7 and 0.73 respective proportions. This data shows the occurrence of simultaneous manner and path expressions in the first cohort in Spanish-speaking Nicaraguans, where the second and third cohorts displayed much less use of such a pattern. These latter two cohorts showed much more use of the sequential manner and path system. The younger children are more likely to execute gestures sequentially by manner only and then path only. This shows that the younger children sign similarly to spoken language, that being discrete and linear, whereas the older generations use more iconic gestures. With the analysis from the study, it can be seen that there is a difference between gesturing and signing. Gesturing is using manner and path simultaneously and holistically like motion itself. This is how the first cohort began forming a language, and now as younger generations begin learning the patterns, they have segmented and sequenced the construction of expressing motion events. From this, NSL has gained discreteness and combinatorial sequencing. The younger cohorts are the ones that are using signing, which are sequential and linear. The sequential combinatorial expressions are more similar to spoken language, but it runs into the problem of ambiguity. When the pattern is manner only and then path only, each element may only acquire a simple sum rather than an entire cohesive sentence or phrase. This has been addressed through sequence patterning for expressing simultaneity. The sign can be made before and after the next sign in order to make an ABA construction. This creates a manner-path-manner relation. Now, when an object has the manner-path-manner pattern, we can tell that the object engages in A action in B direction, specifically being A action, without interference. These new patterns were seen in about 1/3 of the expressions at a proportion of 0.37 from signers in each of the 3 cohorts. The study then observed 15 examples of these constructions for specific manner and path combinations. They used 2 first cohort signers, 4 second cohort signers, and 4 third cohort signers. There were no representations of this construct in the Spanish speakers, so the construct is that of a hierarchical combination that is not utilized in motion events, therefore giving a reason as to why Spanish speakers do not use it. With a hierarchical pattern, the language can produce an infinite amount of phrases with a certain amount of elements. Therefore, taking the gesture-like language and making it into language-like expressions. When looking at the communities that use NSL, the older generations who began the language are still seen as using the gestural patterns, whereas the younger creative learners are using the newer sequential NSL. This provides evidence that children can reanalyze, dissect, and recombine processes for language acquisition where Children can reanalyze, dissect, and recombine processes for language acquisition where adolescents and adults cannot. With early learning skills, children in the 1980s developed NSL into a discrete combinatorial language, which is still used today. The new techniques used identify 2 mechanisms of learning available at childhood. The first is that of dissection of information that then overrides patterns of organization, thus being segmental. The second is the predisposition for linear sequencing, where simultaneous organization is possible, but still not used. The study thus proposed that such learning processes leave an imprint on languages and discrete elements combined into hierarchical constructions. With that said, as long as there are children present that can obtain any said language, there will be learning mechanisms to influence the emergence of change. The linear sequencing of language seen here also appears to be important for language emergence. Such mechanisms have been seen in strong word order regularities in Creole language processes, also indicating the importance of child learning. Children's influence is important for language learning, but it does not fully determine the final language structure. As seen in American Sign Language, or ASL, children break verb expressions into sequential morphemes rather than multiple verb elements. In ASL, oversegmentation has been observed in the manner and path motion events. Manner and path are relevant for lexical patterns as well as segmentation in many, if not all, languages. From these findings, the question posed then becomes whether or not language affects learning abilities or learning abilities affect and shape language. We believe that it is a combination of both. When a language is produced well, children who have good learning abilities will have more access to learning the language. On the other hand, if a child has strong learning abilities, any following language learning would be hierarchical and discrete. This hypothesis then possesses the account of language being both an intrinsically based mechanism as well as one that relies on external mechanisms. Language does not require, quote, passage from generation to generation solely through cultural transmission, end quote, but it also cannot only be an innate process. Language requires external foundations and techniques, and it also requires an internal understanding and ability to retain and develop other techniques. In studies of mature languages, learning mechanisms are redundant with pre-existing language structure. The reconstruction of the Nicaraguan Sign Language has shown that human learning can adapt and change a language to support the creation of a new one. To expand on the essay further, I have found a technical comment and response on children creating core properties of language, evidence from an emerging sign language in Nicaragua. The comments were made by Tommaso Russo and Virginia Volterra. I've also found another study, The Gradual Emergence of Phonological Form in a New Language by Wendy Sandler, Mark Aronoff, Irit Mayer, and Carol Patton. Their essay is investigating the similar process of language production, but in a different culture. I would hypothesize that the emergence of Al-Said Bedouin Sign Language, which is in the gradual emergence of phonological form in a new language, will be similar in that the pattern of expressions found in Senghis et al.'s study, that being newer languages will follow a sequential, discrete pattern rather than a simultaneous one. For this study, I will address the methods used to gather data about certain expressions, as well as how they have emerged. I will also see if they emphasize the importance of children and their learning abilities, or only focus on adult learners. To begin, I want to address the comments and responses on the original essay of interest. The technical comment aims to address the notion that, quote, the author's hypothesis can be considered a weak claim about the innate devices of the language faculty, end quote. Russo and Volterra claim the hypothesis and claims of the essay are too broad and not methodical enough. It is not clear if Senghis et al. Are claiming that discreteness, combination, and linearity are design features that emerge from community users, or whether they emerge from domain general cognitive constraints, or both. Russo and Volterra also question the components of actions of the study. First, they question why there was no detail about whether the signers had any exposure to other communicative inputs, whether it be vocal or written. This includes exposure to spoken Spanish in schools or otherwise. Second, they emphasize the lack of material on hearing participants. Given the hearing participants were important to the study, there should have been more data about their gestures. Russo and Volterra provide that gestural production of hearing participants is mediated by words themselves, and question whether their gestures would have been linear if they had to perform the task without spoken language. Third, they address the omittance of mouthing of deaf signers. They state that other research has found that mouthing emphasizes important elements, and thus Russo and Volterra pose the questions of how important mouthing is in sequencing, as well as its importance to discreteness in hierarchical combinations. Senghis et al. Respond by stating their study was specific to a, quote, definitive component of language and documented its growth by comparing its use by older and younger signers, end quote. They state that their model and design was simple, whereas the change in language was not. Their argument is in support of their findings of language learning within motion event expressions in NSL. Senghis et al. Oppose the disagreements of Russo and Volterra and make points to each of their three disagreements. First, Senghis et al. Explain that exposure to written or vocal Spanish has not changed in 25 years. Exposure is sparse and isolated, therefore, quote, none of the students have an easy command of written or spoken Spanish, end quote, therefore not affecting their gesturing expressions. They extend this to showing the difference of Spanish syntax to NSL syntax, where NSL precedes path, which is roll descend, where in Spanish, path precedes manner, which is descend rolling. The second statement addresses the idea that some gestures are produced in the absence of speech. Senghis et al. Propose other studies by Goldwyn-Meadow, McNeil, and Singleton with English speakers, and Ozarek and Goldmeadow with Spanish speakers, that find gesturing without speech is not likely a source of the segmenting and sequencing found in NSL. Thirdly, they dispute the importance of mouth movements of NSL users. Senghis et al. Explain that mouth movements are always simultaneous with signing, therefore rendering it non-linear and not important to their definitive study. They are looking for sequential expressions and analyzing sequences rather than simultaneity. The original comments on the essay are important because Senghis et al.'s study can easily be seen as too lenient of confounding variables of environment as well as omitting important data. I do agree with Russo and Volterra that there should have been more explanation of the data on the Spanish speakers in contrast with signers, rather than simply omitting the findings. I also feel that Senghis et al. Do not make a strong argument for the importance of mouth movements. I am in agreement that the use of mouth movements along with hand signs will render it simultaneous and nonlinear, but it is not unimportant to include, and they do not provide evidence that mouthing and signing truly happen simultaneously every single time. I believe that comments made on the original essay are very important for bringing ideas of what can be studied further in understanding language emergence. Senghis, Kita, and Ozarek have made a strong first study of the acquisition of the pattern seen in NSL, but it does need further variables to understand the importance of other behaviors that accompany signing, like mouth movement. The third article that I have looked at is an analysis and study of language and gradual emergence of a new language. The article is titled, The article is titled, The Gradual Emergence of Phonological Form in a New Language by Wendy Sandler, Mark Aronoff, Irit Mayer, and Carol Patton. The article looks at linguistic structure, larger units, and sign language, specifically the Al Said Bedouin Sign Language, or ABSL. This new sign language functions as a full language, but in which a phonological level of structure has not yet emerged. For this essay, the gradual emergence of phonological form in a new language mainly focuses on learning and understanding how the, quote, meaningful elements, the morphemes and words, are combined into larger meaningful units, end quote, of language. They also look at the phonology and meaningless elements, speech sounds, and how they promote meaningful elements. This essay maintains that language creation does not necessitate patterning as a large set of signals. Rather, there are capabilities that lie within a manual visual modality. This manual visual modality can accommodate iconically motivated signs, suggesting that a gesture-based language could acquire more holistic signals before requiring duality of patterning. This essay argues that Al-Said Bedouin Sign Language, ABSL, proves Hockett to have been correct about the relative timetable for the emergence of dual patterning. The method of this study entailed 3 different picture naming tasks at 3 different occasions with partially corresponding subjects. The task was administered to 23 subjects, amassing 128 named concrete pictures. For instance, one signer produced the sign in the space in front of the signer's torso with a rubbing movement of the index finger, middle finger, and thumb. Another signer uses all 5 fingers throughout the closing movement, and his sign has a different orientation than that of the one just described, palm down instead of to the side. This shows variance in this one singular sign language. In examining ABSL, there are immediate variations of hierarchies proposed for hand configuration and location based on American Sign Language. Quote, for example, while most ABSL signers select all fingers for dog, one signer A selects only 3. Major body areas, another high-level distinction, varies from head to torso to non-dominant hand. The type of movement varies from hand internal movement to path movement in subject Z, end quote. Other variations include orientation, finger curve, whether there is thumb restraint, and internal movement involving the finger or wrist. These variations seem to appear only as approximate conceptual prototypes rather than specific articulation. These findings amount to analysis of language, changed and synchronic alternations by sociolinguists. When contrasted with other sign languages such as ASL or Israel Sign Language, Al-Said Bedouin Sign Language has the most variations of words, concluding that it does not yet have a defined phonological system. Similar to Senghis et al.'s work, this study has found that third-generation signers with a deaf parent are losing iconicity, the use of icons, and prompting more regulatory and sequential articulation. Like what is seen in NSL, ABSL also utilizes less iconic signs and more discrete expressions and elements. Al-Said Bedouin Sign Language, though it is not finished developing, is a form of communication of a community. Like other languages, it has restrictions and complexities. It is gaining lexical and sublexical variations without a phonological structure. This study did support my hypothesis that Al-Said Bedouin Sign Language is emerging in a similar way to Nicaraguan Sign Language. They both began with iconic expressions, but after generations used and evolved the language, variations and sequential expressions have emerged and are fulfilling the necessities of an evaluative language. The study on Al-Said Bedouin Sign Language did not expand more on the occurrence of sequential changes to the language in children, therefore leaving more space for further studies to figure out whether the changes are more prevalent in all cultures rather than just Nicaragua. These findings are very important for cognitive science in understanding learning abilities and how languages are parsimonious in expansion. Understanding the development of sign language creates a different look at cognition without auditory input and how it affects learning. Yes, so that is my presentation, and this is my works cited. Yeah, that's my presentation, but I also just really wanted to say thank you, Professor. Your class was very, very, very interesting. And even though some of the readings were mind-boggling, your lectures definitely cleared up a lot of confusion with your in-depth explanations. And I also really appreciate how interested you are in the topics, obviously. But that's it. Thank you so much for this semester. I hope you have a great Christmas and New Year's. Yes, thank you.